Welcome to the Resolving Ethical Dilemmas in Advanced Care Planning conference call. My name is James. I'll be your operator for today's call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Later, we will conduct a question and answer session. I would now like to turn the call over to Janelle Shearer. Janelle, you may begin.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome you today on behalf of Stratus Health, the Minnesota organization that is part of the Lake Superior Quality Innovation Network, or LSQIN. The LSQIN represents Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin under the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Quality Improvement Organization program. In addition to these three states mentioned, this webinar is intended for providers working with quality innovation networks in Alaska, Colorado, Hawaii, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Mexico, North Dakota, Oregon, South Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming. So welcome everybody to the call today. Our educational session is Resolving Ethical Dilemmas in Advanced Care Planning. And our objectives are to list several ethical dilemmas that can arise during advanced care planning, understand the ethical responsibility of the professional caregiver, and to describe procedures to be used when ethical dilemmas arise. This webinar is webinar 3 of a 3-part series on advanced care planning. Webinars 1 and 2 are recorded and are posted on the lsqin.org website. I'm pleased today to have Karen Peterson, the Executive Director of Honoring Choices Minnesota, here with me today to present on this webinar for us. And before I introduce Karen, I'll just mention again that all lines are muted, so if you have questions during the presentation, just jot those down, and then we'll have a time for questions and answers at the end. You may also use the chat feature, which is on the right side of your screen, and we'll be monitoring that. We are offering a certificate of participation, which can be used for continuing education credits. After the presentation and before you log off, a short evaluation survey will pop up. So please complete the survey, and then once you've completed it, you will receive a certificate of completion to print off, so it will just pop up on your screen after you submit your survey. If there are others with you in the room that want a certificate, you will just need to make copies for them. So now I would like to introduce Karen. Karen is the Executive Director of Honoring Choices Minnesota, a public initiative of the Twin Cities Medical Society, which focuses on bringing advanced care planning to all parts of our state and beyond. Karen, who received her BSN from the University of Minnesota School of Nursing, is a frequent speaker on this topic and enjoys presenting to diverse groups about the importance of understanding advanced care planning so that every person can share their goals and values about end-of-life experiences. Thanks for coming today, Karen. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Janelle, for that nice introduction, and welcome to all of you who are in the webinar today. There's been a prompt on the comment column on the right of your screen asking you to identify what state you are from and what type of organization you work at. It would be extremely helpful if you would respond to that, just to give me a feel for how many different states and different types of roles are represented in this call, so I can make sure that I'm saying things that are applicable. So we can see the chat comments as you type them, so I'd love to see a live feed of that information. Now, the title of today's talk is Resolving Ethical Dilemmas, and we will be talking about resolutions, but the reality is ethical questions can be very complicated, can be very hard, and frankly can be quite messy. So you may not get all of your questions answered today because sometimes there just aren't simple answers, but I hope to give you some guidance as to how you can proceed. Throughout the talk today, we're going to be asking you some survey questions, and this is the first one. Oftentimes when I'm talking about an ethical situation, I will guide or advise people to contact their ethics team, and so I'm curious how many of you have an ethics team available to you as a reference. So the question has just popped up. You need to click next to the answer, and then you do need to hit submit at the bottom of your bottom of the screen, and we've got 30 seconds for you to answer this question. After everybody answers, we will get a reading of how many different people chose each of the options, and that'll give us all a little bit of insight as to what types of ethics resources we have available. And it looks like the time is done. Now I'm told that this will take about 20 seconds for the results to come popping up. Like I said, it'll be really interesting for me and for each of you to see how many different people have ethics teams available to them and have people who are specializing in ethics to help. Okay. So, 30 of you, 30, the biggest group didn't answer, so that's okay. Otherwise, if most people do have an ethics team located right nearby, a few do not have anything close or not at all. Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. So we're going to start out with making sure that we're all on the same page. So we're going to start with the definition of advanced care planning. Now, advanced care planning is a process, and process really is the most important word in the definition. It allows individuals to talk about healthcare choices now to guide the care they want later. And a well-thought-out and honored advanced care plan actually has been proven to eliminate or minimize harm and jeopardy for a patient later on in their lives. Good advanced care planning will minimize the ethical challenges that might occur or might rise, but notice I chose that word minimize very carefully. I did not say eliminate. We are still all human, and there always are going to be disagreements. Now, advanced care planning as a process has two main components. The first component is conversations. The second is documentation. Of the two, conversations are, we typically say, the most important part of advanced care planning. We would much rather have somebody talk with their family and their care providers about choices that they would like, what their goals and values are, rather than just write it down and not talk about it. But when we look at this through the lens of ethical dilemmas, conversations can be very helpful if it's an easily resolvable issue or question. But if it's a complex ethical question, then it's really nice to have documentation. And the documentation can be forms that the patient filled out. It can be forms such as a healthcare directive. It could be forms that the provider filled out, such as a post, and it can be notes written by caregivers involved in the care of the patient. Your best hope always for dealing with ethical questions is upstream preventative work. Get my mouth. So advanced care planning really comes down to three basic questions, and those of you who maybe have been involved in advanced care planning or have heard me speak before know these three questions. The first one is, who do you trust to speak for you when you cannot? That's in Minnesota, we call that person an agent. In other states, it may be referred to as a surrogate, healthcare power of attorney, or substitute decision maker. But it's the person who's legally named by the patient to make decisions when the patient cannot. The second question that we ask people to consider is whether or not they want life-prolonging measures, including CPR, but this could also be extended time on a ventilator or other technological treatments that would keep somebody alive, even if the healthcare team agrees that your chances of survival or recuperation are very, very slim. And then finally, the third question is, what would you want your healthcare team to know about you? Sometimes this question is phrased as, what are some non-medical things you'd like your healthcare team to know? Now, the first of these three questions is really the most important, and that's going to be your go-to person if you're in an ethical dilemma and your patient, him or herself, is not able to talk to you. The agent is the person who ideally has been well chosen, who has a very, very solid knowledge of what the patient would want or would prefer. And that's going to be the person that you're going to talk to as you work through whatever the questions are. Now, the second thing that you should be aware of is your state law, because in all ethical dilemmas, you also need to know what the legal ramifications and parameters are. Now, in Minnesota, we have clearly written statutes. This statute talks about what makes a healthcare directive legal. You may have a piece of paper from a patient, but if it's not a legal document, you should be aware of that. That's not to say that you should disregard it, but you should understand that it has not been legally completed. So if you're not in Minnesota, you may want to look in your own statutes to find out what is required for a healthcare directive to be legal. The second law that you should be aware of is how you are impacted by the laws about advanced care planning. What are your responsibilities and what are your protections as a healthcare provider? In Minnesota, our law gives you immunity if you are acting in good faith and in accordance with applicable standards of care. And that's very important for you to know. It goes on to a next section which says you are not subject to criminal prosecution or liability or professional disciplinary action if you are relying on a decision made by the healthcare agent and you meet these two requirements. The healthcare provider, you are acting in good faith, and you believe that the agent is acting in good faith. Finally, the third piece of the immunities law in Minnesota is that if you do deviate from the directive to keep a patient alive, despite what the agent is saying, you are protected as long as, again, you take 3 steps. You must notify the healthcare agent of what you're doing and why. You cannot simply make this decision unilaterally. You must tell the agent, because the agent is the legal representation for the patient. You must document exactly what's going on, who's involved, and what the data are that are bringing you to make this deviation. The documentation is really the most important piece. And then finally, you must offer the opportunity to the agent that if he or she truly does not agree with this, they can move the patient. In Minnesota, the agent has the right to determine where a patient receives care and who provides that care. So back to the documentation. Basically, what you're doing in this type of a situation, if you're making a decision on a patient's behalf and the agent is objecting to that, you want to be sure that everything you document is clear enough and thorough enough that if this should go to a court of law, a judge will be able to read it and understand why you were doing what you were doing. So if you're not in Minnesota, I encourage you to explore your state law. As far as the directives go, the usual differences between your laws and Minnesota laws focus on the witnessing requirements, how much involvement is required to be proven by the agent. Some states require an agent to sign a healthcare directive proving that they do in fact know that they are the agent. We don't have that in Minnesota, and I kind of think we maybe should. And then the breadth of the agent authority. Again, in Minnesota, the agent can determine where and who provides care. But there's always, there's differences, I know, among states about that, about whether or not an agent can make decisions about certain mental health treatments. And then there's also differences about whether or not the agent continues to have authority to make decisions once the person has died. Now, in the healthcare directive, there's often a page, or in a healthcare conversation, there's often a time where we ask the patient to reflect on their history and experiences they have had with death in their past. Today, as we're talking about ethics, I think it's critical for us to look at the history of our country and how we have made rules and laws and how our society has learned about healthcare choices at the end of life and advanced care planning. Ann Quinlan was the first landmark case. She was 22 years old. She was Catholic. She was at a party in 1976. She collapsed after ingesting alcohol and some drugs after she had been going through some extreme dieting measures. She was not breathing for 15 minutes before EMTs came. She was placed on life support when she was hospitalized. Her parents petitioned the court to remove that. It took a while, but she did eventually, well, obviously it took a while. She didn't die until 1985 from her injuries that she sustained from that mixture of behaviors and ingestion. After her death, this led to the development of ethics teams in healthcare facilities. At that point in time, the parents had to go to court because there wasn't anybody internally who could work with them to try to find a good solution. It also was the first time a family member had been given a legal right to end what was called extreme measures. Nancy Cruzan, in 1983, she was 25. She was in a car accident. Her car was submerged. Her family wanted to remove life-sustaining treatments, but they had to prove it in court. They had to provide clear and convincing proof that she would not want to live like that. The accident was in 1983. She died in 1990. This was the first time that focus was given to the individual's right to determine ahead of time what types of treatments they would or would not want, and it started a movement towards having living wills. Terri Schiavo is the one that is probably the most famous and most memorable, at least right now. She was 26. She collapsed at home in 1990 from a sudden cardiac arrest. 8 years later, her husband appealed to remove the life support, but her parents fought it. Now, you may all know how far this went. At one point, the federal legislature was looking at videotapes of Terri and trying to make decisions based on how they interpreted those videos. Ultimately, after 14 appeals, the husband's wish was granted in 2005, and this led to the legal rights of the agent or the proxy. Marlise Munoz is a more recent case. In 2013, you may remember this. She was an EMT, as was her husband, and she had a pulmonary embolism. She collapsed at home. The complication came because she lived in Texas and she was 14 weeks pregnant. Even though she had been declared brain dead, even though she had clearly outlined her wishes, her husband, who was her legally appointed agent, the court system overrode all of that because of her pregnancy. And this went into 2 months of a legal battle, eventually ruling that because the mother was brain dead and the fetus was non-viable, she was allowed to be removed from life support. Now, this has not led to a change. This has simply led to a lot of discussion, which continues today, of the rights of a mother if something happens while she is pregnant. And then finally, the most recent and maybe most controversial situation is Brittany Maynard, 29 years old, terminal brain cancer. She moved to Oregon to have the right to end her own life with a medical aid in dying, which was at that time legal in Oregon but not legal in California. This has led to increased national attention, which continues today, to physician or medical aid in dying regulations. So you can see that all of these situations have raised different points of advanced care planning, all of which can be strongly impacted by personal beliefs, values, faith, and all of these types of situations can lead to ethical dilemmas for caregivers. So now let's talk about some of the more common ethical questions that come up related to advanced care planning and related to end of life. The first and probably most common is when a family disagrees. Now, this could happen with or without a legally named agent. The family could disagree on who is the ultimate decision maker. There's a whole other list of questions if the patient is under 18, and whether or not that patient has had any say in their own decisions or if it's all the parents. Questions of when to stop treatments, which treatments to start, where to provide, who's going to provide. All of those can go and blow up into huge family disagreements. Another problem is when someone hasn't done any advanced care planning. And so all of a sudden everybody's faced with making some decisions, but nobody's ever talked about it, and nobody has any idea what the patient's best interest is because nobody has ever asked the patient. A third one is when there are different treatment options that will have different outcomes or predicted outcomes, and it's a matter of balancing what is going to offer the most benefit and the least burden to the family. How is the different treatment options going to affect the whole patient, maybe not just an organ that is failing, but the patient in entirety. This also can bring into questions of futility and scarcity of resources. So sometimes the ethical dilemma isn't something that the family necessarily is worried about, but your employer may be pressuring. And then that's also a good one to think about when you're thinking back to the legal regulations and guidelines. There can also be discord related to cultural, personal, or spiritual beliefs and traditions. There can be ethical dilemmas if the family member has a strong belief in miracles and the healthcare team is believing that the family is in denial. There can be issues if somebody is refusing a treatment or a pain medication, and yet that's not maybe consistent with the overall plan. There can be cultural discomfort based on who's in the room and who's making decisions and how loud are they and to what level can different people be involved and keep things from the patient. And then there also can be ethical issues brought up when the situation that the patient is in was caused by their own reckless or dangerous behavior. For example, liver failure related to alcoholism, or if somebody is ill and is incarcerated. This can evoke a lot of feelings amongst care providers in addition to family members about how to make the best decisions. Interpretation of the written word. Sometimes even if you have a directive, it doesn't solve all your problems because sometimes people write things like, I don't want to be a burden, or I don't want heroic efforts. But if there haven't been sufficient conversations, it's really hard to understand exactly what they meant by that. I actually was at an international advanced care planning conference last week where somebody brought up a research project where they were videotaping conversations between a caregiver and a patient and then having other healthcare professionals watch the videotape and then write a note, chart on that conversation. And then they compared the notes that got written. 10 different people wrote 10 very different notes. So sometimes interpretation of what's heard is also an issue. And then finally, I already talked a little bit about the cost of treatment, sometimes as an issue from the employer or the provider's perspective, but it can also be a problem for the family. Fear of financial ruin for their family is one of the most common things we hear people express in an advanced care directive. So now let's take a trip down memory lane. I know not all of you are nurses, but in social work or medical school, I'm sure at some point you learned about ethical principles, and so we're going to talk about just a quick review of what are these principles of ethics that we are all supposed to be upholding. Autonomy. Obviously, we want to respect the patient's wishes. They have the right to self-determination and to be able to make decisions for themselves. The tricky part is if you as a healthcare provider don't agree with them. Now, when I talk about working with patients with dementia, I always say you can't make your decision on their capacity based on the answer they give. You have to make it on the process they use to make that choice. It's the same thing here. Even if you think it's a wrong decision, you have to respect the process they use to make that decision. Beneficence, you want to have compassion, you want to take positive actions to help your patients, and you want to always be following through on your desire as a healthcare provider to do good. And then its opposite, non-maleficence, of course, is to avoid harming or hurting your patient. Fidelity. You want to show loyalty, dedication, and be an advocate for your patient. You want to remember the virtue of caring that is part of your role. You want to stay true to your patient. Justice. You're going to treat all your patients fairly and equally based on, obviously, the circumstances and benefits and burdens of what's going on with the patient, but also equal and fair distribution of resources. Now, as I was thinking about justice, what came into my mind just this morning was thinking about the healthcare professionals who are working in areas hardest hit by the recent hurricanes, and thinking about how are they have significantly less resources than they're accustomed to, and how are they making their decisions. I would not want to be in that type of a situation. Now, paternalism is a tricky one. It's kind of hard sometimes to see paternalism in a positive light. It sounds like something you don't want to do. But occasionally there can be a situation where you do have to make a decision in your patient's best interest, and you do have to take some level of control. Now, this is a really tricky one, like I said, and this is one where I feel like if you are feeling you need to take control and make a decision on your patient's behalf, you should probably get a second opinion before you make that decision, because this is a really, really hard one to balance properly. And then finally, the principle of totality or integrity, making sure that you are, like I mentioned earlier, considering the entire person, not just looking at a diagnosis or a wound or an organ status, but rather looking at the person as a whole being and making sure that you're taking all aspects of the person into account as you're making your recommendations and giving your treatments. So let's do a quick survey question. Imagine that you have a patient who's dying of lung cancer, and she has asked you not to tell her family about her prognosis. Which of the following three ethical principles will most strongly guide your actions? Will it be non-maleficence? You don't want to cause mental anguish? Will it be the principle of autonomy? Your patient has the right to make this decision? Or will it be the principle of fidelity, where you are remaining loyal to your patient and you're keeping your commitments to her? Which do you think most strongly guides your actions? Okay, the time is up. I hope you all answered. And in about 10 or 15 seconds, we'll see what you voted for. I want you to know I deliberately chose 3 answers that all could be argued as right. And so I'm very curious. Okay, interesting. Almost all of you chose autonomy. A couple people, 3 people chose fidelity. And honestly, I could argue non-maleficence as the strongest ethical principle, too, for this situation. But what I really wanted, and I actually, I'll be honest with you, I kind of hoped that your answers would be more evenly distributed, because I wanted to say that how you choose to answer this question can sometimes reflect your experiences as a caregiver and what types of situations you've been involved with before. But we were pretty closely agreed that autonomy is the big one. And honestly, autonomy really is the root of all advanced care planning, making sure that the patient's voice is heard. So now, before we go farther, I also want to touch on another angle of ethical responsibility, and that is, what do you think your obligation is to the family members and loved ones of your patient? What do you owe the family? What do you owe the people who are there helping? And let's see, I think, yeah, okay, I've got a question coming, but that's in another slide or two. We know from research that being a caregiver is very, very stressful for families, to the point of family members or agents or loved ones receiving a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder after a loved one has died. Studies show 80% experience at least some symptoms of PTSD, and a third of surrogate decision makers experience stress, guilt, and other emotional, sometimes lasting for up to years following the death of their loved one. So another survey question for you. Which best describes your obligation? Oh, we got to get to the next question. I don't have control. There it is. Which best describes your obligation to the people caring for your patient? None or very little, because the patient is your focus. Or is your obligation simply to teach them to take care of their loved one, maybe to do wound care, maybe to do other types of actual physical care? Or do you do that plus emotional support, as long as it doesn't interfere with the care of your patient? Or do you go even farther than that because you understand that their pain will adversely affect your patient? So which one speaks to you? And again, we'll see in a couple of seconds how you all rate this obligation. And in this one, I would say there really is no right or wrong. Obviously, this is a question where it's going to depend a lot on how much care the patient needs, how cognizant the patient is of what's going on, how deep and long-lasting the relationship is between you and the patient and the family members. So it is going to vary based on the circumstances. I'm just waiting for the results. Part of the reason I included some of these questions, like I said earlier, is because there very rarely is a black and white, right and wrong answer when it comes to ethical questions. A lot of it is going to depend on your professional integrity, your experience, your relationship, your level of confidence in how you can work with your patient in the parameters of the location where you're at. This question is taking a little longer. I apologize for that. But I don't want to go on to the next slide until we see the responses. Sometimes technology is as hard as ethical decision making. Okay. Well, while we're waiting, I'm going to go ahead and start talking about what's on the next slide because I don't want to just sit here in silence. The next slide goes back to what I said at the very beginning about the best way to minimize ethical dilemmas and ethical questions is to do advanced care planning upstream, to do preventative work, have preventative conversations. And this is definitely upheld through research and evidence with organizations that have been doing this work for many, many years. We know that doing advanced care planning early, soon after a diagnosis or a significant change in medical and health condition, it gives the family and the patient opportunity to start preparing emotionally. It also gives them the opportunity to do practical preparation. I mentioned earlier that financial stress is often an issue for family members. If you do advanced care planning early, they have the opportunity to meet with financial planners. Okay, oh my goodness, look at that. Almost all of you chose not to answer this question. And I suspect it's because you wanted to say it depends, or, I'm guessing that most of you would want to say it depends. Oh, interesting. Okay, now I'm reading your chat comments that you couldn't get the answer to submit. Okay, well then it wasn't you choosing not to answer, it was technology failing us. Okay, I apologize for that. I will try to talk less about the questions so that you move into answering mode more quickly, because that may be the problem, that I talked too much. Well, I'm going to assume that you would have come in with varied answers to the question, or, like I said, you would have not answered because it does depend. So as I was just saying, research backs up that early advanced care planning can minimize a lot of the problems and questions and issues that come up later at end of life. It gives the family members time to prepare. It also alleviates the burden of decision-making for their loved ones. So this last section about how much obligation do you have to family members and loved ones, again, if they have a clear-cut healthcare directive and have had many conversations with the patient, it's going to be much easier for them, which in turn has been shown to lessen grief and depression amongst survivors. So you remember I said at the beginning the title of this talk is Resolving Ethical Dilemmas. And then I went on to say that resolving isn't always an easy thing to do, but prevention is the key. Barring prevention, or if you're in a situation where you're working with a patient who is in a critical situation and you didn't have a relationship with that patient early on, the second thing that you want to do is be familiar with advanced care planning. Be familiar with the language of advanced care planning. You want to be able to have care conferences where you say to family members, if your mom could speak, what would she be saying? Help them keep the focus on the patient's perspective and not their own, and use that to keep the focus where it should be and hopefully alleviate some disagreement and sharing of conflicting opinions. You also want to be sure, if you have any control over it, to make sure that any documentation that occurs is available to all caretakers, so that if somebody else has talked about advanced care planning, that record of that conversation is in the medical record so that you can find it and read it and learn from it. Because documentation is very important. And ideally, we encourage people to always write a healthcare directive, but sometimes circumstances don't let that happen. Or sometimes somebody has been meaning to get to it and then has a sudden decline in their health condition or a new diagnosis, and they just didn't have time to do it. But if it is there, you want to find it, you want to read it. We know that a lot of times there is information in a medical record that isn't accessed. So do look for it. And if there is nothing that is patient prepared in there, then we go back to the importance of your documentation, of your conversations, whether it's with the patient or with family members. And again, if there's going to be any deviation from what's been charted before, you want to be sure that you're documenting exactly why the deviation occurs, who is involved in the decision making, and what the outcomes are. I'm going to touch on POLST just briefly. I don't know if all of your states have POLST, although I'm assuming most of them do, because I think we're up to 47 states now have some sort of a POLST program, whether you call it POLST or POST or MOLST or MOST. In Minnesota, this is something that's relatively new. We've been working on a statewide POLST project for the past several years, and the biggest question that we see around POLST is that could be related to ethics is how this form is being used or how it's being implemented. We hear a lot of anecdotal stories about facilities not having conversations with family members or with the patient, but just filling out the form and having somebody sign it and declaring a code status and a medical treatment preference without the appropriate conversation. So we recently updated our post form. You can see here section C on the front of the form is now the documentation of discussion, because we really want to emphasize to the healthcare provider who's filling out this form the importance of including the patient whenever possible, the surrogate or family members if they're around, and whether or not a healthcare directive was used. Because in this situation, it goes back to, again, that issue of autonomy and totality and integrity, making sure that the entire patient and the patient's decisions are being honored. So now for the last couple of minutes, we're going to go through some real-life case study examples. I'm going to tell you some situations that I have received. I don't do direct patient care anymore, but I talk to a lot of people who do, and these are real scenarios. And after I read through each scenario, you will be asked to make a choice of two options based on the case. So this first one, patient is on a general medical floor, does not have a pulse. A code is called because his blood pressure and fats are dropping very rapidly. He's in and out of cognitive and verbal ability. At one point, while the team is there, somebody hears him say, "No breathing tube," but then he loses consciousness. In this scenario, the response team determines that he lacked capacity to make that choice for himself, and they did intubate him. So based on what we've been talking about, did the team do the right thing? Hopefully the question will come up in just a moment, and you'll be able to vote A, they did the right thing, since capacity was variable in the emergency situation. Or B, the team did the wrong thing. Since somebody heard him say no breathing tube, that should have been honored. I'm not sure if the question is coming up or not. Okay, because of the way this question is formatted at the bottom of another slide, I'm guessing that our web people might not have noticed it. So instead, I'd just like you to quick type in A or B in the chat, and we'll just do a quick survey that way. Okay, as the A's and B's are scrolling by, I'm definitely seeing both, but I would have to say I'm seeing a few more A's than B's. Okay. Yeah, I can't count that fast as they're scrolling past, but like I said, I'm seeing both answers. I think I'm seeing a few more A's. And I think the justification for choosing A can be, let's stabilize him, let's get him through this emergency scenario, and then hopefully be able to have a conversation, since clearly a conversation has not happened prior. And yeah, I see somebody's writing in, does he have an advanced care plan on file? That should then be honored. Like I said, this is the information I got from somebody. Oh, now we have the questions. Okay, if you could quick do A or B, and then we'll know the exact number. But like I was saying, I think the justification for choosing letter A would be that, yeah, we can't be sure what his capacity level was. It's an emergency situation. Let's get him stabilized. On the other hand, the justification for choosing B could be that the person who heard, or the people who heard him say no breathing tube, understood him to absolutely know what he was saying. Maybe when you see his face, when you hear those words, somebody on the professional team recognized that he knew exactly what was happening, and he was telling them clearly that he did not want that. So there could be justification for either question, which I anticipate will be shown. Yeah, so so we were right. There were A's and B's, but more A's than B's. Okay, we're going to go on to another scenario. I'm going to go ahead and click on this so that the A and B question options come up. Please go ahead and answer them faster than I'm reading, because that way we'll make sure we have enough time. So a patient has been refusing dialysis for weeks, even though she's been told that her renal failure is not reversible. One day it gets to the point where she said, hey, if you don't have dialysis, you're going to die within 2 days. And the patient says, oh, okay, I'll take dialysis. Goes through the one cycle of it. The next day goes back to saying, nope, I don't need dialysis anymore. So the ethics team is called in to work to talk with this patient. Which do you agree with most? Should it be withheld? Because she has a strong history of refusing, even though she did agree one day, and it's non-curative? Or does autonomy win out, and that she must continue to have the daily ongoing right to accept or refuse? Okay. Well, I apologize. The question didn't come up as fast as I wanted it to, and so we're going to have to wait another 15 or 20 seconds to see the results. Again, though, this is a situation where you can make justification for either A or B. And what we don't know here is the history beyond this dialysis decision. We don't know if an advanced care plan has been written or if there is a directive. We don't know if there are family members. Sometimes the patient wants one thing, but the family members are urging him or her to do something else, and they give in to their family, even if it's not what they want. So we don't know that information. Yeah, so most of you, almost all of you, said the patient's autonomy must be the prevailing principle that's used here. But I would also say that if that's the choice that you make, and this is your patient, that you really work hard to have somebody have some meaningful discussions with them, because obviously this is not a sustainable solution. If every time she gets close to death, she agrees and then refuses in between. And so there should be some attempts made to try to change the scenario. Okay, the next one, and again, I'm going to try this just so you know, I don't have control over when the question pops up for you. So if the question can be popped up right now, that would be great. An ER patient, oh, here we go. ER patient is intubated after collapsing, has never been to the system before, does not have a directive or a pulse or indication of an agent. Family arrives several hours later, directive in hand indicating that the patient wants to be, do not attempt resuscitation, demand that he be extubated and treatment stopped. However, the patient is now showing some signs, not a sure thing, but some signs of breathing on his own. Which do you agree with most, A or B? As patient is improving, he should be weaned, or weaning should be attempted, and then asked his current preferences, or the family's request per the legal directive should be honored right away, regardless of what's happening. So I'm curious which most of you are going, or which answer. Oh, look at that. Most of you chose not to answer. And it could be the time, it could be that it just depends, that there are too many unknowns in this scenario. But the ones that did answer were almost exactly evenly split. Okay. We've got two more. A patient with capacity states he chooses to voluntarily stop eating and drinking. The family objects, but the patient is clear, so the staff follows the patient's directions. Eventually, he reaches the point of losing capacity, at which point the family steps in and insists on a feeding tube. So who do you agree with? Do you agree that the staff are obligated to continue to follow the patient's directions, even though now the patient does not have capacity and potentially his legally named agent is changing the decision? Or do you listen to that legal agent? And feeding tube should be put in, at least temporarily, while more efforts are made to have conversations and find the best solution. Now again, this is something, voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, or VSED, is something that is getting a lot of attention right now, especially in states which do not have a legal medical aid in dying law. And this is a way that people can, with control, end their lives without involving medical care. And so this is something that I think we're going to see a lot more of with the discussion. I've been to a couple of conferences where this has really been a hot topic, and people are very eager to hear about it. So we're just waiting to hear what your answer is. Okay, a little bit of a mix. More people say follow the patient's direction. I am going to throw something else out in this situation, though, that may or may not be right, but I would suspect that most of us have seen happen, which is when it's a life and death situation and the directive and maybe the patient and even the healthcare team believe that one decision is best or better, maybe not best, but a family member is standing in the room, yelling very loud and threatening legal action. It does happen that the patient is, in this case, it would be choice B, an intervention is done to buy time. And so that may be something that you just keep in the back of your mind and maybe have some internal discussions with your administration about what are the legal ramifications here. Okay, that ends most of my presentation. I thought I had two more, but it was just one. What it really boils down to is as medical technology increases and our knowledge and our abilities grow, we really can do almost any kind of thing to our patients. The ethical question is, should we? So at this time, I'm going to go back to the chat on the screen. You can certainly write in your questions here. Otherwise, I believe that the phone line is going to open up so that you can also verbally ask questions.
Yes, thank you. We can now begin the question and answer session over the phone. If you have a question, press *1 on your phone. If you wish to be removed from the question queue, press the # sign or the # key. If you're using a speakerphone, you may need to pick up the handset first before pressing the numbers. So once again, if you have a question, press *1 on your phone.
Or you can type it in the chat section too. While we're waiting for a question, I am just going to offer my apologies. This is the first time we've done these survey questions in this type of a webinar, and clearly we need to get a little bit more savvy on the timing of when the polls open and when they close, because I'm reading in the comments that a lot of you were frustrated, and I apologize for that. Well, Karen, this is Janelle. While we're waiting to see if anyone has questions, I have one. I was thinking of a situation where you may need to bring something to an ethics committee. How quickly can people get that pulled together? I mean, is that something that takes like several days or... So Janelle is asking how long does it take to get ethics experts involved, and honestly that's something that I would throw out to you in the audience, because in my experience it's really going to vary. Obviously it's going to vary on how many ethical questions are current in a healthcare setting at any one time. Ideally, I would hope that once ethics experts are needed, they would be able to respond within 24 hours because we truly are often talking about matters of life and death. But in depending on the size of your system and how many cases they're currently involved with, it may take longer. I would expect, though, and this is something that maybe you can check with your own system if you aren't aware, I would expect that this should be considered an urgent request. And I'm seeing some people are writing comments. Somebody says they're able to pull together the ethics team within 4 to 24 hours. Another one says there's a policy saying you have up to 24 hours. Somebody's got to review that request within the first 24 hours. Somebody's asking if there's a geographical variation or age difference. I would guess that, I don't know about geographical, but the age and the status of the patient might make a difference. I would expect that that would be outlined in the request sent to the ethical team, and again, if they had multiple requests come in on one day, they would probably prioritize based on urgency. Anybody else want to share what they do? Or we can move on to another question if somebody has it. Okay, Ralph, I'm rereading your question now as a standalone question, not a response to Janelle's question. You're wondering if there's geographical variation in advanced care planning, maybe. And yes, there definitely is. Not generally philosophically, but more practically. Sometimes different states just don't have anyone taking the lead in developing advanced care programming for their state. In Minnesota, we're very lucky because Honoring Choices exists as an independent, neutral advanced care planning resource for the entire state, but not all states have something like that. So I wouldn't say that philosophically there's a lot of differences. It's more related to what the laws are and what the resources are.
I do have a couple questions over the phone.
Okay.
First question from Lana Dilly. Go ahead, Lana. Is your line muted? Lana, are you there? Okay, our next question from Cheryl Sawyer.
Oh, go ahead. Yes. Question is, we had a resident at our facility who is a quadriplegic, has a trach, has a peg, and that is her life. She recently, at her last day in our facility, told us that she no longer wanted oxygen to her trach and she no longer wanted the tube feeding that we put in her peg. So we documented that, we notified the physician, and the physician basically said, oh, she's in a funk, she's depressed, let's put her on an antidepressant, let's call in a psychologist. So we did all those things, and, you know, the resident was still consistently saying, even to the psychologist, yes, this is what I want, I'm done, you know, no more oxygen, no more tube feeding. And the physician basically kind of convinced her out of it and sort of talks to her and then kind of changes her mind. So she continues to say these things to staff, and we continue to tell the physician, and we just are having a really challenging time getting through to the physician on her wishes. Just wondering if there's anyone has thoughts there.
If anybody wants to type in a response, that would be wonderful. My first thought is there family involved? And is there family who are in agreement with her and can help talk with this physician? And then also, you know, going back to what we asked at the beginning, if your facility does have an ethical team, to bring them in and present this same data or the same scenario that you've just described to us, because, you know, it certainly sounds like every effort has been made to ensure that the patient has capacity and knows what she's asking for and knows what the results will be, and that's the definition of informed consent, is understanding the benefits and the risks and understanding the question and understanding the outcomes. And from what you've described, it sounds to me like she meets those standards, and therefore, according to broad ethical principles, she should be allowed to have her wish honored. If the doctor continues to disagree, I would say it's time to call in someone with authority to talk with that doctor.
Thank you very much.
Yes, well, our time is up, and I see that there are a number of questions in the chat box. I'm feeling like what we need to do to respect everyone's time is if you would like to email that question to info@honoringchoices.org, Karen would be happy to respond back, or you can do the phone call too. You'd probably prefer the email, I would think would be the easiest.
Emails are easier.
So thank you, Karen, for presenting today. Looks like there's a lot of interest in this topic. Ethics are always challenging for everyone. So before you log out today, there will be a survey that will pop up. Once you complete this evaluation survey, and it's fairly short, you will receive a certificate of completion. So that will also pop up. And then if you have additional people in the room with you that need a certificate, make copies for them. Jenna also put in the chat box the direct link to the survey so everybody can take it themselves and get their own certificate that way as well. The session was recorded and will be available on the LSQIN website in about 2 weeks. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and have a great rest of the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may now disconnect.